In the frozen wastes beyond the wall, a blade meets the arm of death itself. Steel rings against ice. For a heartbeat, time stops. Then, impossibly, the ancient evil shatters like glass, exploding into 1,000 frozen shards that dissolve into the winter wind. The White Walker, older than kingdoms, older than memory, ceases to exist. But here is what haunts the survivor of that encounter. The sword should have broken. Every weapon, every spear, every axe that touched those creatures had shattered on contact. Yet this blade held. This blade killed. Why? Welcome, friends, to a journey through the most legendary weapons ever forged. I am your chronicler of forgotten histories, and today we unravel the mystery of Valyrian steel. Before we descend into this tale of fire and ice, of legacy and betrayal, please like this video and subscribe to join us on more journeys through the hidden corners of Westeros. Your support keeps these stories alive. Consider this, in all of Westeros, fewer than 200 of these blades exist. 200 swords scattered across a continent, each one capable of destroying the greatest threat humanity has ever faced. Some hung in great halls, gathering dust while their owners played political games. Others were lost to time, swallowed by the ruins of Valyria or buried with forgotten kings. A handful was stolen. One was broken deliberately, melted down out of spite and pride. And when the long night finally came, when the army of the dead marched south with winter at their backs, only a few of these ancient blades stood ready. The rest remained silent, absent, lost. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Every legend has a beginning. Every sword has an origin. To understand why these blades alone can kill what cannot be killed, we must first travel back to a civilization that no longer exists, to forges that burned with fires no man can recreate. 14 volcanic mountains rose from the Valyrian peninsula, each one breathing smoke and flame into skies filled with dragons. This was the Valyrian freehold at the height of its power. 5,000 years of dominion over the known world. Their cities gleamed with roads of fused stone. Their towers reached heights that modern masons call impossible, and in their deepest forges, their smiths created something that has never been replicated. Valyrian steel. The process was as much sorcery as smithing. Dragon fire provided heat that normal forges could never achieve, flames hot enough to melt and fold metal in ways that defied natural law. But fire alone was not enough. The smiths wove spells into the cooling metal, syllables in languages now dead, binding magic into every molecular layer. Some whisper that blood was part of the ritual, that sacrifices fueled the enchantments that made these blades unbreakable, eternally sharp, lighter than they should be. The rippling patterns in the steel, those distinctive waves of dark and light that mark a true Valyrian blade, are not merely decorative. They are the visible evidence of magic frozen into metal, of dozens of foldings and forgings that transformed ordinary steel into something extraordinary. No rust ever touches them. No whetstone is ever needed. A Valyrian sword feels alive in the hand, balanced perfectly, as if it knows what it was made to do. The Valyrians created thousands of these blades over their long history. Swords, daggers, axes, even arrowheads. They armed their dragon lords and their champions. They traded some to distant lands, gifts to curry favor or seal alliances. But they never ever shared the secret of their creation. The spells remained locked in the minds of their smiths, passed from master to apprentice in rituals outsiders were forbidden to witness. Then came the doom. 400 years before our story begins, every volcano erupted simultaneously. The earth split open. The sea boiled. In a single day and night, the greatest civilization the world had ever known was obliterated. The 14 flames became the smoking sea, a poisoned wasteland where the sky rains ash and demons are said to walk. The dragons died. The smiths died. The spells died with them. Of the thousands of Valyrian steel weapons that once existed, only a fraction survived. Perhaps 200 made their way to Westeros over the centuries, carried by Targaryen conquerors, bought by wealthy lords, or plundered from defeated enemies. 200 blades to face an army of the dead. 200 fragments of a lost world, waiting in the darkness of the long night that was coming. There are swords that take lives, and then there are swords that pass judgment. Ice belonged to the second category. For over 400 years, this great sword had been the soul of House Stark. Taller than most men, requiring 2 hands to wield properly, its blade shimmered with ripples of pale gray smoke frozen into steel. In the right light, those patterns seemed to move like winter mist across a frozen lake. The pommel bore the dire wolf of House Stark, and the crossguard had been shaped by craftsmen who understood that a sword meant for justice should inspire both respect and fear. Nobody knows exactly when the Starks acquired ice. Some meisters suggest it dates back to the Age of Heroes, when the first Stark kings ruled from Winterfell and the wall was newly built. Others believe it came later, perhaps a gift from a grateful southern lord, or spoils from some forgotten war. What matters is that by the time written history begins in Westeros, ice was already ancient, already legendary, already inseparable from the idea of Stark justice. Because that is what ice represented above all else: justice. The North remembers, the saying goes, and ice was the instrument of that memory. When a man took the black and deserted his post at the wall, ice took his head. When a lord broke sacred laws of guest right or kinslaying, ice delivered the punishment. The sword was not used in battle, not swung in the chaos of war, where killing is survival and honor is luxury. Ice was reserved for a different purpose entirely. It was the blade of the man who passes the sentence, who must also swing the sword, who looks into the condemned man's eyes and takes responsibility for the death he delivers. Eddard Stark understood this better than most. He had learned it from his father, who learned it from his father before him, stretching back through generations of Stark lords who carried the weight of northern justice. When Ned executed a deserter from the Night's Watch in the Wolfswood, he did so with ice. When he served as Hand of the King in the capital, far from home and surrounded by southern intrigue, he brought ice with him. The sword stood beside his chair in the Tower of the Hand, a piece of the North in a city that had no understanding of northern ways. The people of King's Landing whispered about the huge grey blade. They found it barbaric that a lord would personally carry out executions rather than delegating the task to a headsman. They did not understand that this was the entire point. The man who passes the sentence must swing the sword. If you would take a man's life, you owe it to him to look into his eyes and hear his final words. You owe it to him to do the deed yourself. Ice had witnessed centuries of such moments. Deserters, murderers, oath-breakers, all of them meeting their end beneath that ancient steel. The blade never faltered. It never dulled. One clean stroke, delivered with the strength and certainty that comes from knowing you are doing what must be done. Then came the day when ice claimed the most tragic head of all. Eddard Stark knelt on the steps of the great Sept of Baelor, surrounded by thousands of citizens who had come to watch a good man die for crimes he did not commit. He had confessed to treason, a lie forced from him to save his daughters, a sacrifice of honor to purchase their lives. Joffrey Baratheon, the boy king with cruelty in his veins, had promised mercy. Ned would be allowed to take the black, to live out his days at the wall serving the realm as his brother had done. But Joffrey was not his father. Robert Baratheon, for all his flaws, understood the value of mercy and the weight of kingship. His son understood only power and the pleasure of wielding it without restraint. When the moment came, Joffrey did not show mercy. He called for Ned's head, and he commanded that the execution be carried out with icy. Sir Tylin Payne, the royal executioner, who had no tongue to protest or counsel patience, drew the Stark ancestral sword. The blade that had delivered justice for 4 centuries would now deliver injustice. The weapon forged to uphold honor would be used to murder it. Eddard Stark, who had wielded ice in righteousness, who had taught his sons that the man who passes the sentence must swing the sword, knelt before his own blade. One stroke, clean and quick, because ice was perfect even in the hands of an executioner carrying out a travesty. The northern lords who heard the news understood immediately what it meant. Killing Ned was an insult to every concept of justice and honor, but killing him with his own ancestral sword, forcing ice to take the head of the man who had wielded it with such integrity, that was a desecration beyond words. It was as if Joffrey had reached into the heart of the North itself and torn something essential from it. Yet even this was not the end of Ice's humiliation. Tywin Lannister, the calculating patriarch of House Lannister, saw an opportunity in the Stark sword. For his entire adult life, Tywin had been obsessed with acquiring a Valyrian steel blade for his house. The Lannisters, despite their wealth and power, had lost their ancestral sword Brightraw centuries earlier. Tywin had tried everything to obtain another. He had offered obscene amounts of gold to impoverished houses who owned such blades. He had dangled lordships and honors. Every attempt had failed. The houses that owned Valyrian steel would sooner starve than sell their heritage. But ice was different. Ice belonged to traitors now, at least in the eyes of King's Landing. Ice was a prize of war, and Tywin Lannister intended to claim it. He summoned Tobo Mott, the master smith of King's Landing, one of the few men in Westeros who had studied the secrets of reworking Valyrian steel, not forging it new. That knowledge died with Valyria, but reshaping existing blades, reforging them into new forms. Even this lesser skill was rare and dangerous. One mistake could ruin steel, worth more than a castle. Tywin's command was simple and devastating. Melt down ice. Destroy the Stark legacy. From its metal forge 2 new swords for House Lannister. Tobhar Mott worked for days in his forge, heating the pale gray steel to temperatures that made the air shimmer, folding and hammering, speaking the half-remembered spells that would keep the magic intact even as the shape changed. The smoke that rose from his chimney that week was darker than usual, as if the forge itself mourned what was being unmade. When the work was finished, ice no longer existed. In its place were 2 swords, both rippling with the distinctive patterns of Valyrian steel, both infused with an additional color that had not been there before. Tywin had demanded that Lannister crimson be worked into the metal, the red of his house mixed with the gray of House Stark, blood into steel, conquest made visible. 400 years of history, melted and divided. The sword that had represented justice became 2 weapons that would serve very different purposes in the wars to come. One would be called Oathkeeper, a name that honored the very concept Tywin had just violated. The other would be named Widow's Wail, a cruel jest delivered at a royal wedding by a boy king who thought himself clever. Ice was gone. But as we shall see, the steel that had been ice, the Valyrian metal that remembered 4 centuries of northern justice, was not quite finished telling its story. Sometimes destruction is not an ending but a transformation. Sometimes breaking one thing creates 2 others that will serve purposes their makers never intended. The wolves were scattered, but they would return, and when they did, pieces of ice would be there, protecting the very family that Tywin Lannister thought he had destroyed forever. From the ashes of ice came 2 swords, each destined for a Lannister hand. But destiny, as Westeros would learn, cares little for the plans of men. The first blade emerged from Tobhar Mott's forge, with patterns of deep crimson rippling through smoky gray steel. The red seemed to pulse in certain light, as if Lannister blood had truly been mixed into the metal rather than simply alchemical pigments. It was shorter than ice had been, lighter sized for a hand smaller than Eddard Stark's. Tywin Lannister presented this sword to his son Jaime at a private ceremony, expecting gratitude and pride. Instead, he received silence. Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer, the man who had broken his most sacred oath by murdering the king he was sworn to protect, stared at the beautiful blade with something approaching revulsion. Here was everything his father valued. Wealth transformed into legacy. Stark defeat made tangible. A symbol of Lannister supremacy forged from the humiliation of their enemies. But Jaime had changed during his captivity in the north. He had lost his sword hand to a brutish nobody on a bridge. He had traveled hundreds of miles in chains with Brienne of Tarth, a woman who actually believed in the oaths that Jaime had spent years mocking. And in a moment of weakness or perhaps clarity, he had made a promise to Catelyn Stark. He had sworn to find her daughters and keep them safe, to return them to their home. An impossible promise from a maimed knight to a woman who had every reason to hate him. Yet it was the only oath Jaime had made in years that actually meant something. So when his father presented him with a sword forged from Stark steel, Jaime saw an opportunity for something his father could never understand: redemption. He found Brienne preparing to leave King's Landing. She had been released from her duties, dismissed by the Lannisters who had no further use for her. Jaime gave her the sword, along with armor and gold. He gave her the mission that he could not complete himself: find Sansa Stark, protect her, keep the oath he had made to her mother. Brienne, ever literal, asked what the sword was called.
Jaime had not thought of a name. In that moment, looking at this woman who represented everything he had once mocked and now admired, he chose a name that mocked his own past: Oathkeeper. A sword to keep the promises he had broken. A blade to honor the oaths he had violated. The name was sincere and sardonic all at once, perfectly suited to a man who had spent his entire life trapped between cynicism and yearning for something better. Brienne accepted the sword with the solemnity of a knight taking a sacred charge. She understood, perhaps better than Jaime himself, what the blade represented. This was Stark steel being used to protect a Stark daughter. This was a Lannister undoing, however slightly, the harm his family had inflicted. This was the possibility that even broken oaths might be mended. Oathkeeper would become Brienne's constant companion through everything that followed. She wore it while searching for the Stark girls across the war-torn riverlands. She wielded it against bandits and deserters. When she finally found Arya Stark, briefly she had Oathkeeper at her side. When she encountered the Hound and fought him in single combat, Oathkeeper held against his brutish strength. And when she finally, after so much searching, found Sansa Stark in the north and swore herself to the service of House Stark, she did so with a sword made from ice hanging at her belt. The second sword had a darker birth. Tywin kept this blade for himself initially, intending to pass it to Joffrey as a wedding gift. The young king was marrying Margaery Tyrell, cementing an alliance between the Lannisters and the wealthiest house in the south. It should have been a moment of triumph. At the wedding feast, Joffrey received the sword before all the assembled nobility of Westeros. He drew it and admired the way light played across the red and grey patterns. Someone asked what he would name such a magnificent blade. Joffrey, with the casual cruelty that defined his short reign, glanced at his uncle Tyrion and smiled. He knew that Tyrion had been married against his will to Sansa Stark, a marriage that would never be consummated, a political arrangement that brought nothing but misery to both participants. The sword, Joffrey announced, would be called Widow's Wail. The name was meant as mockery of Sansa, of her dead father and brothers, of all the grief the Starks had endured. It was the kind of joke that Joffrey found hilarious, completely unaware of how it revealed his own monstrous nature to everyone watching. Within hours, Joffrey was dead, poisoned at his own wedding feast.
choking and clawing at his throat, while Widow's wail lay forgotten on the table beside him. The sword meant to celebrate his power outlived him by only a few hours. He never swung it in battle, never used it for anything beyond cutting a pie and announcing a cruel name. Widow's wail passed to Tommen, Joffrey's younger brother, a gentle boy thrust into kingship by his brother's death. Tommen had no interest in swords or warfare. He wanted to outlaw beats and make cats legal to inherit lands. Widow's wail hung on his wall, beautiful and unused, a weapon in the hands of someone who would never wield it. When Tommen died, thrown from a window in his own castle, or perhaps jumping of his own despair, the sword had no clear heir. Eventually, it came to Jaime, who found himself in possession of both swords forged from ice, the blade he had given away and the blade he had inherited, both stark steel, both now in service to a man who had spent the last several years trying to become someone worthy of them. There is a painful symmetry in what happened to ice. One sword became a tool of honor in the hands of the most honorable knight in Westeros. The other became a decoration for unworthy kings before finally reaching someone who understood what it meant to carry Valyrian steel. The metal itself seemed indifferent to these human dramas. Valyrian steel does not judge its wielders. It serves whoever holds it, cutting through flesh and bone with equal efficiency whether swung by heroes or monsters. But there is something profound in the fact that ice, which represented 400 years of Stark justice, ended up protecting Stark daughters after its destruction. Tywin Lannister thought he was erasing the Starks when he melted their ancestral sword. He thought he was creating Lannister legacy from Stark defeat. What he actually did was scatter pieces of the North across Westeros, placing them in hands he never intended, serving purposes he never imagined. When the long night came, when the dead marched south and Winterfell stood as the last defense of the living, both swords would be there, Oathkeeper in Brienne's hand, fighting beside Jaime, Widow's wail in Jaime's hand, defending the castle of the family he once tried to destroy. Ice had been broken, but its purpose survived. Sometimes a sword story does not end when it is destroyed. Sometimes that is only the beginning of something larger, something its makers and breakers could never have predicted. The steel remembers, even when shaped into new forms. It remembers justice, it remembers honor, and in the end, it returns to protect what it was always meant to defend. Some swords are inherited through blood, others are earned through fire. For 500 years, Longclaw had been the pride of House Mormont, passed from lord to son on the cold shores of Bear Island. The blade was distinctive among Valyrian swords, a bastard sword that could be wielded with one hand or two depending on circumstance. Its steel rippled with the characteristic patterns of Valyrian craftsmanship, waves of light and shadow frozen in metal. The original pommel had been shaped like a bear, the sigil of House Mormont, roaring in defiance of all threats. Then came disgrace. Jorah Mormont, heir to Bear Island and bearer of the family sword, committed a crime that left no room for forgiveness. He sold poachers into slavery to pay for luxuries. His wife demanded slavery, the practice that the North found more abhorrent than almost any other sin. When his crime was discovered, Jorah fled across the narrow sea rather than face Eddard Stark's justice. He left everything behind, his home, his family, Longclaw. The sword remained with his father, Jeor Mormont, who had already taken the Black years before. Jeor, called the Old Bear by his brothers in the Night's Watch, served as Lord Commander at Castle Black. He had given up his family name when he took the Black, but he kept the family sword. It was one of only a handful of Valyrian blades at the wall, probably the only one in active service. The Night's Watch needed every advantage it could find. Beyond the wall, dangers gathered that the South had long since dismissed as myth. The Old Bear knew this better than most. He had commanded rangers who disappeared without trace. He had heard reports that he could not quite dismiss as superstition. Something was waking in the far north, something ancient and hostile. Into this environment came Jon Snow, bastard son of Eddard Stark, taking the black because he had no place in the world of legitimate heirs. Jon expected to become a ranger, to ride beyond the wall and face whatever threats lurked in the haunted forest. Instead, the old bear made him his personal steward. It seemed like an insult, a reduction to servant status when Jon yearned for adventure and purpose. Then came the night that changed everything. A wight attacked the Lord Commander in his chambers. The corpse of a ranger, killed beyond the wall and brought back to Castle Black for burial, rose up with unnatural strength and murderous intent. The dead man's eyes burned blue with cold fire. His hands closed around Jormon's throat with a grip of something that no longer felt pain or fear. Jon Snow grabbed a lantern and smashed it into the wight. Oil spread across the floor, and flames engulfed the creature. Jon's hand burned in the fire, but he held fast, fighting the monster until it finally stopped moving. By the time his brothers broke down the door, Jon had saved the Lord Commander's life at the cost of his own flesh. The Maesters bandaged his burned hand, and Jon recovered in his chambers, expecting perhaps a commendation or reassignment. What he received instead was impossible. The old bear came to see him personally. He brought Long Claw, the 500-year-old blade that represented everything House Mormont had been before disgrace tainted the name. Giroir explained simply that the sword was wasted on an old man who no longer ranged beyond the wall. Giroir had earned it through courage and sacrifice. Jon tried to refuse. He understood what Longclaw meant. This was not just a weapon but a legacy, the soul of a great house. A bastard had no right to such an heirloom. Besides, Jorah Mormont still lived somewhere across the sea. Surely the sword should be kept for him, or for his heirs if he ever redeemed himself. The old bear would not hear objections. His son had disgraced himself and would never return. The sword needed someone who would use it honorably. Jon Snow, bastard or not, had proven himself worthy. There was one more detail. Giroir had commissioned the castle smith to replace the bear pommel with a wolf. The dire wolf of House Stark gleamed in silver at the base of the blade, transforming a Mormont sword into something that belonged to Jon Snow specifically. The old bear had not just given him a weapon, he had given him an identity. Jon carried Longclaw on his first ranging beyond the wall, part of the great expedition to discover what had happened to the missing wildling army. At the Fist of the First Men, surrounded by whites and White Walkers, Longclaw sang through dead flesh without hesitation. The blade that had defended Bear Island for centuries now defended the realms of men against an enemy that had not been seen for thousands of years. But it was at Craster's Keep that Jon learned the true value of what he carried. The mutineers had killed the old bear and seized control of Craster's stronghold. Jon and a small group of loyal brothers came to bring the traitors to justice. In the chaos of combat, one of the mutineers gained the upper hand. He was about to kill Jon when a White Walker appeared, drawn by the sounds of conflict or perhaps by its own unknowable purposes. The Walker moved with inhuman grace, faster than ice should be able to move, its frozen sword raised to deliver death. Jon brought Longclaw up to parry, expecting the Valyrian blade to shatter as every other weapon did when it contacted the Walker's ice magic. Instead, steel met ice and held. The sound that rang out was clear and true, metal against frozen magic, and neither broke. The White Walker's eyes widened in something that might have been surprise. In 8,000 years of existence, it had perhaps never encountered this particular obstacle. Jon did not waste his advantage. He pressed the attack, and when Longclaw finally struck true, piercing through the Walker's torso, the creature exploded. It did not die like a man dies, bleeding and falling. It shattered like glass struck by a hammer, bursting into 1,000 fragments that dissolved almost instantly into vapor and mist. In that moment, Jon understood several things at once. The old stories were true. White Walkers existed and could be killed. Valyrian steel could kill them. And the Night's Watch, which everyone in the south dismissed as a dumping ground for criminals and bastards, stood as the only barrier between humanity and an enemy that could raise the dead to fight for it. The knowledge came with terrible weight. How many Valyrian blades existed in all of Westeros? Perhaps 200. How many of those were in the hands of people who would actually fight the White Walkers, rather than cowering behind castle walls? Far fewer. Jon returned to Castle Black with that knowledge burning in his mind. He had the mutineers executed, the Old Bear avenged, and Longclaw cleaned of traitor blood. The sword had proven itself against the ultimate enemy. Now Jon needed to convince anyone who would listen that the enemy was real. The battles that followed tested both Jon and his blade. At Castle Black, defending against Mance Rayder's wilding army, Longclaw cut through raiders and warriors. At Hardhome, facing White Walkers and their white army, the sword rang against ice magic again and again. Each time a walker fell, shattering into nothingness, the truth became more undeniable. Valyrian steel remembered the fires of its forging. Deep in the molecular structure of the blade, dragon flame and ancient magic made it anathema to the ice magic that animated White Walkers. Fire versus ice, life versus death. The ancient Valyrians who had faced threats from beyond the known world had created these blades for a reason. Their smiths might have known about the White Walkers. They might have forged weapons specifically to combat ice magic, even if that knowledge was lost over the centuries. Jon offered more than once to return Longclaw to House Mormont. When he met Jorah's cousin Lyanna, the fierce young lady of Bear Island, she refused. The sword was his now, earned not inherited. When Jon encountered Jorah himself, exiled and searching for redemption, the older man simply nodded at the blade and said it was in better hands than his. Through the Battle of the Bastards, through the wars for the North, through the expedition beyond the Wall, to capture a White and prove the threat to Southern lords who refused to believe, Longclaw remained at Jon's side. The sword became part of his identity as much as his bastard name or his white direwolf. And when the long night finally came, when the army of the dead marched on Winterfell with Winter incarnate at its head, Jon stood in the Godswood with Longclaw drawn. Whites fell by the dozens to its edge. The blade never dulled, never hesitated, never failed. Some swords choose their wielders. Longclaw had belonged to House Mormont for 5 centuries, but it had been waiting for Jon Snow, a bastard with no birthright, no inheritance, no claim to glory, just courage, honor, and the willingness to stand against the darkness when the darkness came. The wolf had claimed the bear's sword, and the blade sang all the more truly for it. Not every sword finds its way to a hero through honor and ceremony. Some must be stolen. Heartsbane had served House Tarly for 5 centuries, a great sword that required considerable strength to wield effectively. Longer than Longclaw, heavier than ice had been, the blade demanded a warrior's build and a warrior's skill. The Tarleys of Horn Hill were a martial house, proud of their military tradition, and Heartsbane embodied everything they valued: strength, prowess in battle, the ability to stand unbroken against any foe. Randyll Tarly, Lord of Horn Hill, and one of the finest military commanders in Westeros, lived and breathed these values. He had been the only general to defeat Robert Baratheon in open battle during the rebellion. He commanded respect and fear in equal measure, and he expected his heir to reflect the glory of House Tarly. Instead, he got Samwell. Sam grew up soft in a world that prized hardness. He preferred books to swords, learning to hunting, kindness to dominance. Every quality that might have made him an excellent maester or scholar became evidence of weakness in his father's eyes. Randall did not simply disapprove of his son, he despised him with the particular venom reserved for family members who failed to meet impossible expectations. The breaking point came when Sam's mother gave birth to another son, a boy who might grow into the heir Randall wanted. Sam, by law and tradition, stood between this younger brother and the inheritance. Randall could not legally disinherit his firstborn, but he could make Sam's life so unbearable that taking the black seemed preferable to staying home. The ultimatum was delivered without sentiment: join the Night's Watch voluntarily, or die in a hunting accident. Randall would have his martial heir one way or another. Sam, terrified and heartbroken, chose the wall. He surrendered his name, his inheritance, his future, everything except his life. Heartsbane remained at Hornhill, waiting for a son worthy of wielding it. Years passed. Sam took his vows, survived beyond the wall, killed a White Walker with dragonglass, and became one of the few people in Westeros who truly understood the threat facing humanity. He traveled to the Citadel to forge his chain, to become a maester who could serve the Night's Watch with knowledge instead of a sword arm. The Citadel, ancient and hidebound, proved resistant to his warnings about White Walkers. The Archmasters listened to his accounts with polite skepticism, as if Sam were describing a particularly vivid dream rather than witnessed reality. They asked for more evidence, more proof, more time to deliberate. Meanwhile, winter crept south, and the army of the dead grew larger with every passing week. Sam made a decision that would have seemed impossible to the frightened boy who left Hornhill years before. He would steal Heartsbane from his father and take it north, where it could actually serve a purpose. The theft required returning home, walking back into the house that had rejected him so completely. His father and brother were away, serving Daenerys Targaryen in her conquest of Westeros, which made the timing perfect and painful all at once. Sam would be stealing from the family that had cast him out, but he would not have to face his father's contempt directly. His mother and sister greeted him with genuine warmth, the only members of his family who had ever treated him with kindness. They fed him, asked about his adventures, and seemed genuinely proud of what he had accomplished at the Wall and beyond. For a brief moment, Sam felt what it might have been like to grow up in a family that valued him. Then he went to his father's chambers and took Heartsbane from where it hung on the wall. The sword was heavier than he remembered, requiring both hands just to carry it properly. Sam had never trained with this blade, never been allowed to even touch it except under supervision. Randall had made it clear that Sam would never be worthy of Tarly steel. Now Sam was proving his father right in the worst possible way, by stealing rather than earning. But Sam understood something his father never could. Worthiness was not about strength of arm or skill in battle. It was about being willing to do what must be done, even when it terrified you, especially when it terrified you. He left Hornhill with Heartsbane wrapped and hidden, Gilly and little Sam at his side, heading north to a war his father refused to believe was real. The journey gave him time to think about what he had done. By the laws of the realm, he was a thief. By the oath of the Night's Watch, he had forsworn all family ties, and therefore had no claim to Tarly property. By every measure of honor his father valued, Sam had disgraced himself. Yet Sam felt no shame. His father could rage about tradition and honor all he wanted from whatever southern battlefield currently occupied his attention. Meanwhile, the Night King marched south with an army that could end all of humanity. What good was an ancestral sword hanging on a wall when the world itself stood on the edge of annihilation? When Sam arrived at Winterfell, he did not parade Heartsbane through the halls or boast about his theft. He kept it close, uncertain what to do with a weapon he could barely lift, let alone wield effectively. Then he encountered Jorah Mormont, who had returned from exile to serve Daenerys Targaryen. Jorah was preparing for the coming battle with a simple arming sword, adequate but unremarkable. Sam knew Jorah's story, exiled for dishonor, searching for redemption, fighting to protect a queen he loved hopelessly. Most importantly, Sam knew that Jorah's father, the Old Bear, had commanded the Night's Watch and died beyond the wall. Jorah Mormont had saved Sam's life more than once, had believed in him when Sam barely believed in himself. The decision formed clearly in Sam's mind. We found Jorah and offered him Heartsbane. Jorah tried to refuse, understanding the magnitude of what Sam was offering. This was a family heirloom, one of the precious few Valyrian blades in existence. Sam should keep it, or return it to House Tarly, or at the very least give it to someone he owed a debt to rather than a relative stranger. Sam explained simply. He was not a fighter. The sword would be wasted in his hands. But Jorah was a warrior who had fought across 2 continents, who had saved Daenerys' life repeatedly, who knew how to turn steel into salvation. More than that, Jorah Mormont had been a father to Sam in ways his actual father never was. This was a way to honor that debt, to pass something valuable to the son of a man who had shown Sam what real strength looked like. Jorah accepted Heartsbane with the solemnity of a man receiving a sacred trust. He understood what Sam had done to acquire it, the courage required to steal from family in service of a greater need. In Jorah's hands a Tarly sword would defend Winterfell, a blade forged for a martial house would serve in the greatest battle humanity had ever faced. When the dead came, Jorah stood in the courtyard with Heartsbane flashing in the firelight. He cut through whites with the ease of a master swordsman wielding a perfect weapon. He defended Daenerys through waves of attackers, and when he finally fell, mortally wounded after hours of combat, he died with a Tarly greatsword in his hand and honor restored to his name. 2 houses, both touched by disgrace. 2 men, both rejected by their families. A stolen sword connecting them across distance and death, serving its purpose not because of tradition but in spite of it. Sometimes the greatest act of honor is breaking the rules that honor demands. Not every Valyrian sword writes a grand story. Some merely exist beautiful and deadly and ultimately irrelevant to the events that shape the world. In the Vale of Arryn, House Corbray kept a blade called Lady Forlorn. The name itself speaks to tragedy, though the details have been lost to history. Perhaps a Corbray lady died in some dramatic fashion. Perhaps the sword was taken from a defeated enemy whose wife mourned him. The truth no longer matters. What remains is a slender blade of rippling Valyrian steel, elegant in its lethality, passed down through generations of Corbray lords. When we encounter Lady Forlorn in recent history, it rests in the hands of Selyn Corbray, a knight whose reputation matches his sword's beauty, not at all. Lyn is cruel where his blade is elegant, brutish where the steel is refined. He delights in killing, and makes no secret of his nature. At the Battle of the Trident during Robert's Rebellion, he slew Prince Lewin Martell of the Kingsguard with Lady Forlorn, a significant achievement, killing a knight of the Kingsguard in open battle, yet it feels somehow diminished by the wielder's character. Lady Forlorn becomes a prop in Littlefinger's political machinations in the Vale, a threat held in reserve, but never quite deployed for any purpose that matters. Here is a blade that could shatter White Walkers, held by a man embroiled in schemes about succession and influence, while the real war gathers in the north. The sword sits in the Vale, safe behind its mountains, far from the wall where it might have served humanity's survival. This is the tragedy of distance and isolation. The Vale, protected by its natural barriers, chose neutrality for most of the wars that ravaged Westeros. Lady Forlorn never rode north. It never faced the army of the dead. One of the precious few weapons capable of killing White Walkers remained sheathed while the fate of humanity hung in balance. Across the sea on the Iron Islands, a different kind of legacy festered. The Ironborn, who take pride in their raiding culture, possess two Valyrian swords that embody their philosophy perfectly. Neither blade was forged for them, or inherited through noble lineage. Both were stolen. Nightfall belonged to House Harlaw, taken from some defeated enemy during one of the countless raids that define Ironborn history. The blade carries dark ripples through its steel, ominous and fitting for a people who worship a drowned god, and believe that paying for anything diminishes its value. We do not so, the Greyjoys declare, and the Harlaws live by the same principle. Why forge or buy when you can simply take? House Drum possesses Red Rain, another plundered treasure from a nameless victim. The steel ripples with dark red hues, and whether this coloring came from the original forging or from centuries of blood is a question the Drums seem uninterested in answering. The sword represents their proudest tradition, that strength and audacity matter more than legitimacy or honor. There is something deeply ironic about these weapons. Valyrian steel, forged by the greatest civilization in history through mastery of dragon magic and sophisticated sorcery, ends up in the hands of raiders who pride themselves on producing nothing. The contrast between the refinement required to create such blades and the brutality of their current owners would be amusing if it were not so tragic. Because here, too, we find White Walker killers sitting idle while the true war unfolds. The Ironborn spend the wars of succession raiding coastal villages and squabbling over which worthless rocks they control. Nightfall and Red Rain, blades capable of shattering ancient evil, serve merely as status symbols for a culture obsessed with appearing fearsome. When Daenerys Targaryen arrives in Westeros with her dragons and her army, some Ironborn bend the knee, others resist and die for their pride. Neither choice brings their Valyrian steel north to Winterfell. The swords remain in the Iron Islands, having contributed nothing to the survival of humanity, except as symbols of a culture too proud and too isolated to recognize when the world needs them. In Oldtown, the oldest city in Westeros, House Hightower maintained its own Valyrian blade called Vigilance. The name suits a house whose seat includes the tallest tower in Westeros, a lighthouse that has guided ships for thousands of years. The Hightowers style themselves as watchers and guardians, keepers of knowledge through their relationship with the Citadel. Yet for all their vigilance, for all their supposed wisdom, Vigilance the sword remains in Oldtown, while the long night descends on the north. The Hightowers, wealthy and powerful, choose to preserve themselves rather than risk their precious steel in a war that southern lords barely believe is real. This is perhaps the most damning failure of all. The Citadel, with its vast library and centuries of accumulated knowledge, sits in Oldtown. The Meisters, who should understand the historical reality of White Walkers better than anyone, train and study in the Hightower's shadow. Yet when Samwell Tarly brings evidence and testimony about the army of the dead, the Archmeisters choose skepticism over action. Meanwhile, Vigilance hangs in Hightower vaults, its name a mockery. What good is Vigilance that sees nothing? What value does a guardian blade have if it guards only itself? The Southern swords collectively represent a failure of imagination and courage. Their owners understood that Valyrian steel held value. They treasured these blades, displayed them proudly, and used them as symbols of their house's importance. Yet when the ultimate test came, when these weapons could have served their original purpose as humanity's defense against supernatural evil, they remained absent. Geography played a role, certainly. The distances in Westeros are vast, and news travels slowly. A lord in the Vale or Oldtown might genuinely not understand the urgency of the threat until too late. But ignorance does not excuse absence, particularly when multiple warnings reached the south and were dismissed or ignored. There is also the question of belief. For thousands of years, White Walkers existed only in children's stories and ancient histories. Southern lords had more immediate concerns: succession disputes, trade agreements, harvest yields. The idea that ice demons might march south and end all human life seemed fantastical compared to the tangible problems of politics and economics. This is how civilizations fall. Not through sudden apocalypse that no one could predict, but through collective failure to recognize existential threats until they arrive at the gates. The Southern Lords looked at their Valyrian steel and saw heirlooms, symbols, investments. They never imagined these blades as tools forged specifically to combat a threat their ancestors had faced and barely survived. So Lady Forlorn remained in the Vale. Nightfall and Red Rain stayed with their ironborn keepers. Vigilance watched over Old Town, and nothing more. Perhaps a dozen other Valyrian blades scattered across the south followed the same pattern, cherished and useless. When the Battle of Winterfell ended and dawn broke over exhausted survivors, when the count was made of who had stood and who had not, the absence of these southern swords became clear. A handful of Valyrian blades had been present: Longclaw, Oathkeeper, Widow's Wail, Heartsbane, Arya's Dagger. Perhaps one or two others carried by minor lords who had the wisdom to ride north. Against an army of the dead, this pittance had to suffice. The other 200 or so Valyrian weapons in Westeros sat elsewhere, useless as decoration, their potential wasted. There is no redemption in this part of the story. The southern swords did not arrive late to save the day. They simply never came at all. Their owners survived the long night through the courage of others, protected by blades they had refused to risk and warriors they had refused to support. History will record that humanity survived its greatest test, but history should also note who answered the call and who stayed home. The geography of courage shows clearly on any map of Westeros. The further south you travel from the Wall, the fewer Valyrian swords you find in stories of heroism. Some weapons rust from disuse. Valyrian steel never rusts, never dulls, never weakens, but it can be wasted all the same, kept safe and polished and entirely meaningless while the world burns and brave people die defending those too comfortable to defend themselves. The southern swords remained beautiful. They remained valuable. They remained sharp enough to kill White Walkers, had any White Walkers come south enough to meet them. They also remained, in the way that matters most, completely and shamefully absent. Before the Starks had ice, before the Mormonts carried Longclaw, the Targaryens brought two blades from old Valyria that would shape the destiny of Westeros for 3 centuries. Dark Sister came first in legend, if not in forging. Slender and elegant, the blade was made for speed rather than power. Where most Valyrian greatswords required a warrior's strength, Dark Sister could be wielded by someone who relied on quickness and precision. The sword found its perfect match in Visenya Targaryen, sister and wife to Aegon the Conqueror. Visenya was the dark mirror to her sister Rhaenys. Where Rhaenys charmed and entertained, Visenya commanded and fought. Where Rhaenys played at being a queen, Visenya embodied the steel beneath the crown. She flew Vhagar, the smallest of the 3 original conquest dragons, but perhaps the fiercest, and she carried Dark Sister into battles that forged the 7 kingdoms from squabbling territories. The blade sang through the wars of conquest, taking the heads of kings who refused to bend the knee. It defended Aegon's life when Dornish assassins came in the night. It upheld Targaryen law when rebels rose against the new dynasty. Dark Sister became synonymous with Targaryen strength, the reminder that dragons were not their only weapon. After Visenya's death, Dark Sister passed through several hands, always finding its way to warriors rather than politicians. Prince Daemon Targaryen, the rogue prince, wielded it during the Dance of the Dragons, that terrible civil war that killed more dragons than survived. Daemon's final battle saw him leap from his dragon Caraxes onto Aemon Targaryen's Vhagar mid-flight, driving Dark Sister through his nephew's remaining eye before both dragons and both riders fell into the God's Eye Lake. The blade survived what its wielder did not. It was recovered and continued through Targaryen history until it reached Bryndon Rivers, better known as Bloodraven. This Targaryen bastard served as Hand of the King, then as Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. When he took the Black and traveled north, Dark Sister went with him. Then nothing. Bloodraven disappeared beyond the wall during a ranging taking Dark Sister into the frozen wilderness. For decades, he was presumed dead. The sword was lost. But Bloodraven did not die. He became the three-eyed raven, living in a cave far beyond human civilization, waiting for Brandon Stark to find him and inherit his mantle. Whether Dark Sister remained with him, buried in that cave or hidden elsewhere, is a mystery that may never be solved. The blade that helped conquer Westeros vanished into the lands the wall was built to defend against. There is terrible irony in this. Dark Sister, forged to kill, ends up beyond the wall where White Walkers gather, a Valyrian blade, capable of shattering the army of the dead's greatest weapons, sits somewhere in the frozen north, perhaps within miles of the enemy it could destroy. Yet it never appears when needed most. Bloodraven, who sees past and future through his green sight, never sends his sword south to Winterfell. Perhaps the blade is lost, buried under snow, or lost in the cave when the Night King's forces overwhelm Bloodraven's sanctuary. Perhaps it remains hidden, waiting for someone to find it in some future crisis. Or perhaps Bloodraven understood that other weapons would suffice, that Dark Sister's role in history had ended when it brought him north to his destiny. The second Targaryen blade tells a different story of loss, one wrapped in ambition and civil war. Blackfire was Aegon the Conqueror's personal sword, the blade he carried when he united the Seven Kingdoms under Dragonfire. Made of Valyrian steel, rippling with smoke-dark patterns, Blackfire became the ultimate symbol of Targaryen legitimacy. Whoever wielded that sword could claim to be Aegon's true heir, the rightful ruler of Westeros. For generations, Blackfire passed from king to heir without incident. Then came Aegon IV, called the Unworthy, a king whose corruption and cruelty left scars on the realm that would bleed for a century. Aegon IV had many children, most of them bastards born of his numerous mistresses. On his deathbed, he legitimized them all with a single decree, setting the stage for succession crises that would plague his descendants. Worse, he gave Blackfire, the symbol of legitimate rule, to his bastard son Daemon, rather than to his legitimate heir Daeron. The message was clear and catastrophic. Aegon IV, even in death, was declaring that his bastard was more worthy than his true-born son. Daemon took the sword in the name, becoming Daemon Blackfire, and the realm split between those who supported Daeron's legal claim and those who followed Daemon's martial prowess and royal favor. The first Blackfire rebellion erupted in blood and fire. Daemon Blackfire nearly won, leading armies that believed him to be the true king. He died at the Battle of the Red Grass Field, cut down along with his twin sons in a battle that decided the fate of the dynasty. The Blackfire sword survived its wielder and passed to his remaining sons, becoming the rallying symbol for 4 more rebellions over the next 60 years. Each rebellion failed. Each generation of Blackfire pretenders died or fled to exile. And somewhere during these endless conflicts, the sword itself was lost. Some say it sank with a ship fleeing Westeros. Others claim it was buried with the last Blackfire pretender in an unmarked grave. The truth vanished into the chaos of civil war. What remains is absence. Blackfire, which represented ultimate legitimacy and power, which helped forge an empire, disappeared because one corrupt king used it as a tool of spite and division. The blade that should have passed quietly from ruler to heir became instead a symbol of civil war, and ultimately nothing at all. These two losses, Dark Sister and Blackfire, represent different forms of tragedy. Dark Sister vanished in service, carried beyond the wall by a man pursuing duties greater than personal glory. Its disappearance serves a purpose we may not fully understand. Blackfire vanished in waste, destroyed by human ambition and the petty cruelties of bad kings who valued spite over stability. Together, they represent perhaps the two greatest Valyrian steel weapons ever brought to Westeros. Dark Sister, forged for a conqueror's sister. Blackfire, wielded by the conqueror himself. Both older than any other blade in the Seven Kingdoms, both carrying histories that shaped the entire continent, and both absent when humanity faced its ultimate test. Imagine if Dark Sister had been at Winterfell, pulled from Bloodraven's cave and carried south by some enterprising ranger. Imagine if Blackfire had been recovered from wherever it was lost, placed in the hands of a worthy warrior. Two more Valyrian blades against the army of the dead. Two more weapons capable of shattering White Walkers. Would it have mattered? Perhaps, perhaps not. The Battle of Winterfell was won through sacrifice and a small dagger, not through accumulated Valyrian steel, but the absence still stings. These legendary weapons forged for greatness, missing from the greatest battle of all. The Targaryens brought dragons and Valyrian steel to Westeros. They used both to conquer and rule. In the end, they lost the dragons to civil war and hubris. They lost their greatest swords to ambition and mystery. What remains are stories and questions. Where is Dark Sister now? Will anyone ever find Blackfire? And what does it say about humanity, that our most powerful weapons are always somehow absent when we need them most? Some losses burn deeper than others, festering across generations until they become obsessions that define entire houses. House Lannister, the richest family in Westeros, could buy almost anything. Their gold mines ran deeper than any others. Their wealth financed kingdoms and wars. Yet for all their riches, they could not purchase the one thing that mattered most to their pride, a Valyrian steel sword. They had possessed one once. Brightroar, the ancestral blade of House Lannister, had been a magnificent weapon carried by Lannister lords for generations. The name itself spoke to their house's confidence and glory, a bright roar of golden strength. Then it disappeared, swallowed by the same catastrophe that destroyed Valyria itself. Tommen Dethican Lannister, possessed by either courage or madness, decided to sail to Valyria after the doom. 3 centuries had passed since the cataclysm, but the ruins still smoked with poisonous fumes. Demons and strange creatures were said to haunt the broken peninsula. Ships that ventured into the smoking sea rarely returned, and those that did brought back crew members afflicted with terrible diseases and madness. Tommen believed the risk worthwhile. Valyria had been the wealthiest civilization in history. Its treasures lay scattered in the ruins, waiting for someone bold enough to claim them. He took Brightroar and a ship full of ambitious men sailing east toward fortune and glory. None of them returned. The smoking sea kept their bones, their ship, and Brightroar. House Lannister lost its Valyrian blade to hubris and greed, perhaps the most fitting end for such a sword. The loss became a wound that would not heal. Every generation of Lannisters afterward felt the absence of that blade. They were the wealthiest house in Westeros, yet they lacked the one symbol that would prove their worth among the great families. The Starks had ice. The Mormonts had Longclaw. Even lesser houses possessed Valyrian steel. But the Lannisters, for all their gold, had nothing. Tywin Lannister inherited this obsession from his father and grandfather. From the moment he became Lord of Casterly Rock, acquiring a Valyrian blade became one of his primary ambitions. He understood that such swords represented more than mere weapons. They were legacy made tangible, proof that a house had endured for centuries and would endure for centuries more. Tywin tried everything. He approached impoverished houses that owned Valyrian steel, offering staggering sums of gold for their ancestral blades. He was refused every time. A house might lose its lands, its castle, even its name, but they would not sell the one thing that proved they had once been great. He attempted to commission a new blade, seeking out the few smiths who claimed knowledge of reworking Valyrian steel. But creating new Valyrian steel was impossible. The spells had died with the Valyrian smiths. The techniques were lost. Even the raw materials, whatever strange ores and components the ancient forgers had used, were no longer available. Tywin offered rewards for the recovery of lost blades. He sent expeditions to search for Brightraw in the smoking sea. Every attempt failed. The ruins of Valyria kept their secrets and their treasures, refusing to yield anything to Lannister gold. Decades passed. Tywin became Hand of the King, the most powerful man in Westeros next to the king himself. He orchestrated the destruction of House Rayne and House Tarbeck, cementing Lannister dominance in the Westerlands. He managed the realm's finances and military. He shaped the course of kingdoms. Yet he could not obtain a Valyrian sword. The frustration must have eaten at him constantly. Every council meeting where he sat across from lords who wore ancestral blades, every feast where Valyrian steel hung on walls as casual decoration, every reminder that other houses possessed what all his wealth and cunning could not acquire. Then the War of the Five Kings provided an opportunity born from tragedy. Eddard Stark was executed as a traitor. His son Robb was crowned king in the north. Ice, the 400-year-old blade that represented everything House Stark had been, became a spoil of war. Technically, it belonged to the crown, to Joffrey Baratheon, but Joffrey was Tywin's grandson, and Tywin had not spent decades craving Valyrian steel, only to let it slip away now. He commanded that ice be brought to King's Landing, not to be returned to the north. Not to be held in trust until the war ended, to be destroyed. Tobbo Mott, the smith who performed the deed, must have understood what he was being asked to do. Melting down ice would not restore Brightraw. It would not undo the loss that had haunted House Lannister for 3 centuries, but it would transform Stark steel into Lannister steel, and perhaps that substitution was close enough to satisfy. The forging took days. Valyrian steel resists change, even when subjected to dragonfire heat and master craftsmanship. The spells woven into the metal do not break easily, but Mott was skilled, and he had Tywin's complete support and unlimited resources. 2 swords emerged from Ice's destruction. Tywin had them colored with Lannister crimson. Red pigments worked into the gray smoke patterns. The result was striking. Beautiful even, red and gray flowing together, Lannister and Stark, blood and steel. But it was not Brightraw. These blades, for all their beauty, were forged from another house's legacy. They carried the weight of Stark history and Stark justice, no matter what new names they received or whose hands wielded them. Tywin could color them crimson and call them Lannister, but the steel remembered where it came from. More than that, the acquisition came wrapped in dishonor. Tywin had not recovered a lost blade through bold adventure. He had not commissioned new steel through rediscovered art. He had simply taken another house's sword and melted it down. The act of a man so desperate for Valyrian steel that he would destroy a 4-century legacy to create a pale imitation of what his house had lost. The obsession had consumed him so completely that he could not see the hollowness of his victory. He had Valyrian swords now, technically. House Lannister possessed 2 blades where they had possessed none, but they were swords forged in dishonor, obtained through destruction rather than creation, symbols of how far the mighty had fallen in their desperation. Brightraw died in Valyria through foolish ambition. Ice died in King's Landing through calculated spite. Both losses spoke to Lannister character, to the particular way their pride and obsession led them to ruin what they claimed to value most. Tywin died before seeing those swords used for any purpose that mattered. He never knew that the steel he had stolen and reshaped would defend Winterfell against the army of the dead, would protect Stark daughters, would serve the North he had tried so hard to humble. The gold of Casterly Rock could buy armies and kingdoms, but it could not buy back what was lost, and it could not create legacy through theft. Some wounds do not heal, they simply become part of who you are. Not all Valyrian steel comes in the form of great swords passed down through noble houses. Some pieces are smaller, easier to hide, perfect for murder rather than honor. The dagger that would change the course of history was barely longer than a man's hand. Its blade rippled with the characteristic patterns of Valyrian steel, dark smoke frozen in metal. The hilt had been carved from dragon bone, an unusual choice that marked this weapon as something special even among Valyrian artifacts. Someone had crafted this dagger with care, making it both beautiful and lethal. Its origins remain mysterious. Unlike the great ancestral swords whose histories span centuries, this dagger appeared in the Game of Thrones without fanfare or legend. It simply existed, passed between hands through theft and deception, accumulating lies as it moved through the shadows of power. The first time we encounter it, the blade is being pressed to the throat of a sleeping child. Brandon Stark, second son of Eddard Stark, lay helpless in his bed at Winterfell. He had survived a fall from a tower that should have killed him, but the fall had left him unconscious and broken. While Bran slept, a hired killer crept into his chambers with the Valyrian dagger, sent to finish what the fall had started. Catelyn Stark fought the assassin barehanded, her fingers cut to the bone as she grabbed the blade to keep it from her son's throat. The direwolf Summer tore out the killer's throat, but not before Catelyn understood that someone wanted her son dead badly enough to send a murderer with a priceless weapon. The question became, who owned such a dagger? And the answer provided would poison the realm. Catelyn brought the blade south to King's Landing, seeking answers. Littlefinger, master of coin and master of lies, examined the weapon and declared that it had belonged to Tyrion Lannister. He claimed Tyrion had lost it to him in a bet, though he later won it back. This was a lie, carefully crafted to push Catelyn towards suspecting the Lannisters of trying to murder her son. The lie worked. Catelyn, already suspicious of the Lannisters after discovering that they had been involved in her son's fall, took the bait. She arrested Tyrion when she encountered him at the inn at the crossroads. That arrest set in motion a chain of events that would lead to war between the Starks and Lannisters, thousands of deaths, and the fracturing of the Seven Kingdoms. All because of a lie about a dagger. The truth was simpler and more pathetic. The dagger had belonged to King Robert Baratheon, part of his collection of weapons. Joffrey, his cruel and stupid son, had stolen it and given it to the assassin. Joffrey's motivation was twisted sentiment, a desire to impress his father by finishing off the crippled Stark boy. Robert had mentioned once, while drunk, that a merciful man would put the child out of his misery. Joffrey took this drunken rambling as instruction. He hired a killer and provided a Valyrian steel dagger for the deed, not understanding or caring about the consequences. The boy who would become king had no concept of proportional response. A child needed killing, so send a killer with a priceless blade. Simple. After Catelyn's arrest of Tyrion, the dagger disappeared into the chaos of war. It resurfaced years later, brought to Littlefinger by Bran Stark himself. Bran had become the three-eyed raven by then, able to see past and present through his green sight. He knew the dagger's history, knew the lies Littlefinger had told about it, knew that this small blade had helped start the war that killed his father and brothers. Bran gave the dagger to Littlefinger in a moment laden with unspoken meaning. Littlefinger, who had schemed and manipulated and lied his way to power, received a weapon from a boy who could see through every deception. The message was clear to anyone who understood what Bran had become. Your lies are known. Your schemes are visible. You hold the instrument of your own treachery. Littlefinger did not understand the warning. He kept the dagger, perhaps thinking it a generous gift from a crippled boy he had helped in the past. Then Bran gave it to Arya. The gift seemed casual, almost dismissive. Bran, speaking in the flat effect of someone who sees all of time simultaneously, told his sister that the dagger was wasted on a cripple. Arya needed a weapon. Bran had no use for such things anymore. Take it. Arya accepted the blade that had been meant to kill her brother. She tested its balance, felt the perfect weight of Valyrian steel in her hand. This was not a sword that required strength to wield. This was an assassin's tool, made for speed and precision. It suited Arya perfectly, as if the blade had been waiting through all its travels to reach her hand specifically. She trained with it in the Winterfell courtyard, sparring with Brienne of Tarth. The dagger moved like an extension of her arm, faster than Brienne expected, dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with size or reach. Arya had trained with the faceless men in Braavos, learning to kill with anything and nothing. Give her Valyrian steel, and she became something terrifying. The dagger's purpose crystallized in the Godswood during the longest night. The Night King came for Bran, for the three-eyed raven, for the living memory of the world. His white walkers and whites had carved through the defenders of Winterfell. The Godswood stood as the last refuge, the final position before complete annihilation. Theon Greyjoy died defending Bran, his spear shattering against the Night King's armor. Nothing could stop this ancient evil from reaching the boy who saw everything. Except Arya Stark, appearing from shadows and silence. The Night King caught her by the throat, lifting her effortlessly. His grip should have crushed her windpipe. His strength was inhuman, overwhelming. But Arya had trained her entire life for moments of impossible odds. She dropped the dagger from her right hand, caught it with her left, and drove it up into the Night King's torso. Valyrian steel met ice magic, and the magic shattered. The Night King exploded into frozen shards, his body disintegrating into nothing. Every White Walker he had created shattered in the same instant. Every white that those walkers had raised collapsed into permanent death. The entire army of the dead ceased to exist because one small blade found its target. A dagger forged in old Valyria, passed through theft and murder, used as a tool for lies and assassination, ended the longest night and saved humanity. There is no prophecy that predicted this. No ancient text that foretold a small blade wielded by a girl with no name saving the world. The great Valyrian swords fought bravely that night. Longclaw, Oathkeeper, Widow's Wail, Heartsbane, all of them carved through the dead and defended the living. But the killing blow came from a weapon small enough to hide, wielded by someone trained to strike from shadows. The Catspaw dagger, named for the kind of assassin who serves as a pawn for greater powers, became the most important Valyrian steel in all of Westeros, not through destiny or inheritance, but through arriving in exactly the right hands at exactly the right moment. Sometimes the smallest blade casts the longest shadow. 8,000 years of history collapsed into a single night. Every sword, every story, every blade that we have followed through theft and honor and obsession, they all converged on Winterfell when the dead came marching south. The castle prepared for siege unlike any in living memory, not against an army that could be negotiated with or defeated through superior tactics, against an enemy that felt no pain, no fear, no exhaustion, an enemy that grew stronger with every defender it killed, because death itself served the Night King. The living gathered what advantages they could find. Dragon-glass weapons armed thousands of soldiers, brittle and crude but effective against whites. Fire barrels and burning pitch lined the walls. 2 dragons circled overhead, living weapons of their own, and scattered among the defenders, so rare as to seem almost mythical themselves, a handful of Valyrian steel blades. Longclaw hung at Jon Snow's hip as he stood in the Godswood. His position was both sacred and tactical. Bran Stark sat beneath the ancient weirwood tree, bait for the Night King, the three-eyed raven, offering himself to draw out the ultimate enemy. Jon's duty was simple and impossible. Protect Bran, hold the Godswood. Do not let the Night King reach the boy who could see all of history. The dead came like a tide of frozen limbs and empty eyes. They crashed against the living in waves that never stopped, never hesitated, never broke formation out of fear or confusion. Whites that had been wildlings, farmers, children, all of them repurposed into instruments of ending. Jon's blade sang through the darkness. Every swing of Longclaw removed limbs, split skulls, sent whites collapsing into permanent stillness. The Valyrian steel cut through frozen flesh and ancient bone without slowing. Where normal swords would dull or shatter from the impact of hitting frozen tissue repeatedly, Longclaw remained perfect. The edge that had been forged in dragon flame centuries ago still held true. But killing whites while necessary was not the true purpose. Whites could be defeated by anyone with fire or dragonglass. The real threat walked among them, 7 White Walkers who commanded the dead and could freeze any living thing with a touch. Across the courtyard, Brienne of Tarth fought beside Jaime Lannister, the two of them defending the castle's vulnerable eastern flank. Oathkeeper flashed in Brienne's hand, the crimson and grey blade cutting arcs of destruction through the press of bodies. She had trained her entire life for combat, studied every technique and form, but nothing had prepared her for this. The enemy did not tire, did not retreat to regroup, did not show any human response to pain or loss. Jaime fought beside her with Widow's Wail, the twin blade forged from the same steel. His left hand, the only hand he had now, wielded the sword with less grace than he had possessed before his maiming, but with desperate determination. Every white he killed was one less that could reach the people sheltering in the castle. Every moment he bought was another chance for humanity to survive. The irony of their position was not lost on those who knew the history. 2 swords forged from ice, the ancestral blade of House Stark, now defending Winterfell in the hands of a Lannister and the woman he had gifted it to. The steel that Tywin Lannister had melted down to spite the Starks had returned home, protecting the very family he had tried to destroy. A White Walker emerged from the chaos of combat, its ice blade gleaming with cold fire. The creature moved with inhuman speed, cutting through defenders who tried to block its path. It fixed its frozen gaze on Brienne, perhaps sensing the Valyrian steel she carried, recognizing a threat that needed elimination. Brienne met the charge without hesitation. Oathkeeper rang against the Walker's ice sword, steel against frozen magic, and neither broke. The sound that echoed across the courtyard carried surprise. White Walkers were accustomed to their weapons shattering any normal blade on contact. They had faced humanity's armies before and found them wanting. But this blade held. Brienne pressed the advantage, her training and determination driving her forward. When Oathkeeper finally connected solidly with the Walker's torso, the creature exploded into frozen shards, its body disintegrating as completely as if it had never existed. Every white that Walker had raised collapsed in the same instant, dozens of dead bodies suddenly becoming dead bodies again, the magic animating them severed at its source. Across the battlefield, similar confrontations played out wherever Valyrian steel met ice magic. Jorah Mormont wielded Heartsbane with the skill of a man who had fought on 2 continents, who had served in armies and survived impossible odds. The Tarly Greatsword, stolen by a coward and given to an exile, proved its worth in the hands of someone fighting for more than honor or glory. Jorah fought to protect Daenerys Targaryen, the woman he loved without hope of return, the queen who had given his life meaning after years of disgrace. Heartsbane cleaved through whites with mechanical efficiency. The blade was heavy, meant for a strong man with perfect technique, and Jorah possessed both. He stood before Daenerys, as wave after wave of dead crashed against his position. His armor took hits that would have killed unprotected men. His body accumulated wounds that should have slowed him, but he kept fighting, kept swinging, kept standing between the woman he loved and the darkness that wanted to consume her. When a White Walker came for him, Jorah met it with heartsbane, raised and steady. The first exchange told him what he needed to know. The sword would hold. Valyrian steel could match ice magic. The creature could be killed. The fight was brutal and quick. Jorah had spent his life learning war, and he used every lesson now. Feints and counters, strength and timing, everything he knew channeled through a blade that never faltered. Heartsbane took the walker's head in a clean stroke, and another portion of the army of the dead collapsed into stillness. But there were too many whites, too many walkers, too much darkness pressing against too few lights. The Valyrian blades carved paths of destruction through the enemy, but paths closed as soon as they were opened. For every white killed, two more took its place. The dead felt no morale failure, no fear of casualties, no hesitation in the face of impossible odds. The living began to fall back. Exhaustion took its toll. Even the finest warriors cannot fight forever, and this battle had already lasted hours. Jorah took a wound that went deep, then another. He staggered but did not fall, would not fall, while Daenerys still needed defending. In the Godswood, Jon fought with Longclaw through endless waves of whites, trying to reach Bran, trying to fulfill his duty. But the Night King had planned well. His forces kept Jon away from the weirwood tree, preventing any interference with what was about to happen. The Night King walked through the chaos untouched by the combat surrounding him. His generals followed, 7 White Walkers in formation, a procession of ancient evil moving with terrible purpose. They entered the Godswood where Theon Greyjoy stood as the last defender before Bran. Theon charged with a dragonglass spear, brave and doomed. The Night King caught the weapon easily and broke it across his knee. Then he drove the shattered spear through Theon's body, killing the man who had once betrayed the Starks and died defending them. The Night King approached Bran, reaching for the boy who saw everything, preparing to end the three-eyed raven and erase human memory from existence. His hand stretched toward Bran's face, victory assured. Arya Stark appeared from the darkness without sound or warning, launched through the air with a Valyrian steel dagger in her hand. The Night King caught her by the throat, his reflexes inhuman, his strength overwhelming. Arya hung in his grip, her windpipe closing, her vision narrowing. She should have died there, another failed attempt to stop the unstoppable. But Arya had learned from the faceless men in Braavos. She had trained with Syrio Forel in the Red Keep. She had survived Harrenhal, the Hound, the House of Black and White, and the long road home. Every lesson, every near death, every moment of her life had prepared her for this single motion. She dropped the dagger from her right hand, caught it with her left, drove it upward into the Night King's torso with all her strength. The blade that had been meant to kill her brother, that had started a war through lies, that had passed through murderers and schemers, pierced through ancient ice magic, and found whatever passed for a heart in the Night King's frozen body. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The Night King stared at this small human who had somehow succeeded where armies had failed. Then he shattered. The explosion was not loud, but it was absolute. The Night King burst into fragments of ice that dissolved into mist. Every White Walker he had created suffered the same fate simultaneously, exploding across the battlefield wherever they stood. Every white those walkers had raised collapsed into permanent death, the magic animating them severed completely. The army of the dead, hundreds of thousands strong, ceased to exist in an instant. Silence fell across Winterfell. The living stood in shock, unable to process that they had survived. Bodies littered the ground, but they were only bodies now, not enemies. The threat that had gathered for 8,000 years, that had seemed unstoppable and inevitable, had ended because one small blade reached one precise target. Jorah Mormont collapsed into Daenerys' arms, his wounds too severe to survive. He died holding Heartsbane, a sword that was never his by right, but which he had wielded with honor when honor mattered most. The Tarly blade was cleaned and put away, its purpose served, waiting for whatever future would claim it. Longclaw rested in Jon's hands, covered in the evidence of 1,000 wights cut down. Oathkeeper and Widow's Wail, the twin blades from ice, had defended the castle of their origin. All the great swords had served with distinction. But the small dagger, the assassin's tool, the blade no one had considered legendary, had killed the Night King and saved the world. Dawn broke over Winterfell, cold and grey and impossibly beautiful. The survivors emerged from the castle to see what they had accomplished and what it had cost. The Valyrian steel blades, forged in dragonfire centuries ago for purposes their makers never knew, had finally fulfilled their destiny. Not through prophecy or divine plan, but through arriving in the right hands at the moment when humanity needed them most. The long night had ended. The swords that ended it would become legend themselves, stories told for the next 8,000 years. If humanity survived that long, the morning after the longest night arrived with unexpected gentleness. Snow fell softly on Winterfell, covering the scars of battle beneath a blanket of white that made the world seem clean again. The survivors moved through the courtyard in a daze, still unable to fully comprehend that they had lived when so many had not. The Valyrian steel blades were cleaned with care and reverence. Blood and darkness wiped away, revealing the rippling patterns beneath. These swords had proven themselves in ways their previous owners could never have imagined. They had faced the ultimate test and emerged victorious, not because of prophecy or destiny, but because they happened to be in the right hands when humanity needed them most. Longclaw remained with Jon Snow, though his path forward had become uncertain. He had learned truths about his parentage that complicated everything he thought he knew about himself. The bastard sword carried by a bastard now belonged to someone who was neither bastard nor truly Stark. Yet the blade felt right in his hand, as if the 500 years of Mormont history mattered less than the bond forged through actual use. When the political struggles concluded and Jon rode north beyond the wall with the free folk, Longclaw went with him. Perhaps this was always its destiny. The sword that had served the Night's Watch, that had defended against the darkness, returning to the lands where that darkness had originated. A blade forged in civilization, protecting those who lived beyond its borders. The wall still stood, though its purpose had changed. There were no more White Walkers to guard against, but there were wildlings who needed land to settle, mysteries in the frozen north that remained unexplored, and a man who had been born to rule but chose freedom instead. Longclaw would serve in that capacity, a reminder that duty takes many forms and not all of them involve crowns or castles. Oathkeeper stayed with Brienne of Tarth, who became Lord Commander of the Kingsguard in the New Kingdom. The sword that had been named for keeping promises continued its service in the hands of someone who understood what oaths actually meant. Brienne had spent her entire life trying to prove herself worthy of knighthood, of honor, of the ideals she believed in so fiercely. Now she commanded the guards who protected the king, wielding a blade forged from stark steel to defend the realm. The irony was gentle rather than bitter. Ice had been destroyed, but its purpose survived in new forms. Brienne ensured that the blade lived up to its name, keeping the oaths she had sworn to protect the innocent and serve with honor. Widow's Wail passed into uncertain hands after Jaime Lannister's death, the blade that had been named in cruelty by a boy king, that had served briefly in the hands of a knight seeking redemption, now existed without a clear owner. Perhaps it would be returned to House Lannister, what remained of them. Perhaps it would find a new wielder entirely, someone who could give it a purpose beyond its dark origins. The name itself seemed less significant now. Joffrey had meant it as mockery, but widows had wailed during the long night. Countless women had lost husbands to the army of the dead. The blade had defended them, had fought to prevent more widows from being created. Sometimes even cruel names can find noble purpose through the actions of those who wield them. Heartsbane's fate remained unclear. Jorah Mormont died holding it, giving his life to protect Daenerys Targaryen in humanity's darkest hour. The sword had been stolen from House Tarly by Samwell, given to a Mormont, and used to defend a Targaryen queen. 3 houses, 3 different purposes, all connected through a single blade. Sam survived the long night, and eventually became Grand Maester, serving the new king with wisdom rather than steel. He had no use for a greatsword, and returning it to House Tarly meant giving it back to a family that had rejected him utterly. Perhaps Heartsbane would remain at Winterfell, a memorial to the man who wielded it in humanity's greatest need, or perhaps it would find its way to someone who needed a reminder that courage comes in unexpected forms. The southern blades that never came north remained where they had always been. Lady Forlorn, with House Corbray, Nightfall and Red Rain with their Ironborn keepers, Vigilance in Old Town. These swords had not failed in the technical sense. They simply had not been there when needed. Their owners survived because others fought and died in their place. History would be kind to them, probably. The songs and stories would speak of the blades that defended Winterfell without dwelling too much on the ones that stayed home. But the survivors knew. The people who had stood in the darkness and felt the cold breath of the Night King's army. They would remember which houses sent their swords north and which kept them safe in vaults. That memory would shape politics and alliances for generations. Trust had been earned in blood and steel. Absence had its own cost, paid in respect lost and influence diminished. The lost blades remained lost. Dark Sister, wherever Bloodraven had taken it beyond the wall, never reappeared. Perhaps it lay buried in the cave where the 3-eyed raven had waited for Bran. Perhaps it had been claimed by the Night King's forces before their destruction. Or perhaps it still waited in the frozen north. Another mystery for future rangers to discover. Blackfire, lost to the Blackfire rebellions generations ago, stayed lost. Whatever ship or grave or ruin held that blade kept it secret. The sword that had symbolized Targaryen legitimacy no longer mattered in a world where Targaryens no longer ruled. It had become an artifact of a dead age, important only to historians and those who romanticized the past. Brightraw remained in Valyria's ruins. If it survived at all, the Smoking Sea kept its treasures jealously. Tommen Lannister's bones probably lay near the blade he had sought, both of them consumed by the same hubris that had destroyed the greatest civilization in history. Some prices are too high, some ambitions too dangerous. Brightraw's fate stood as a permanent reminder of that truth. The mathematics of survival had proven brutal. Of the approximately 200 Valyrian steel weapons in Westeros, perhaps 5 or 6 were present at the Battle of Winterfell. That tiny fraction had to suffice against an enemy that had gathered strength for 8,000 years. It should not have been enough. But it was, not because of the steel alone, but because of the people wielding it. Courage matters more than metal. Unity defeats division. Sacrifice transcends birthright. These lessons, written in blood on the grounds of Winterfell, became the foundation for whatever came next. The great houses that had played their political games while ignoring the real threat learned their own lessons, though whether they learned them well enough remained to be seen. Humanity has a remarkable capacity for forgetting danger once it has passed. The White Walkers had seemed like myth until they arrived. Give it a few generations and they would be myth again, stories told to frighten children. But the swords would remain. Valyrian steel does not rust or corrode. The blades that fought at Winterfell would survive for centuries more, passing to new owners, serving new purposes, accumulating new stories. Each one carried the memory of the long night in its steel, a physical reminder that the impossible had happened and been survived. Longclaw in the far north, Oathkeeper in the capital, Widow's Wail seeking a new purpose, Heartsbane waiting for a worthy hand. The dagger that killed the Night King probably returned to House Stark, the smallest blade with the greatest story. They rest now in peace, these fragments of a lost civilization. The forges that made them are cold. The spells that strengthened them are forgotten. The dragons whose fire heated them are gone, yet the swords endure as they have always endured, waiting patiently for the next time humanity needs them. Because there will be a next time. There is always a next time. Different enemies, different crises, different forms of darkness. The wheel keeps turning, as it always has, and the swords that remember will be ready. Somewhere in a castle armory, Valyrian steel gleams in dim light. The rippling patterns flow like smoke frozen in metal. The edge remains perfect, untouched by time or use. The blade waits with infinite patience, as only steel can wait. Its story is not finished. None of their stories are finished. They are simply resting between chapters, gathering strength for whatever comes next. The snow continues to fall on Winterfell. The survivors rebuild what was broken. The dead are mourned and honored. Life, persistent and stubborn, continues. And the swords, ancient and perfect, watch over it all in silence. If you have found value in this journey through steel and history, through legends and truths, please consider subscribing to join us for more explorations of the hidden corners of Westeros. There are always more stories waiting to be told, more mysteries waiting to be unraveled, more legends waiting to be understood. Until then, may your own blade stay sharp and your courage stay true. The world is full of darkness, but it is also full of those willing to stand against it. That has always been enough. It will always have to be. Rest well.